Bitterness. People have tasted it in cucumbers. It probably makes some people hate cucumbers. Why are these things bitter? Is it genetic? Meaning, is it related to the variety? Is it related to how it's grown? Is it climate caused? Why are cucumbers bitter? And is there a way to avoid it?
Bitterness is highly misunderstood in cucumbers. There's a great deal of misinformation that about its causes and solutions for a bitter cucumber. Just first of all, if you get a bitter cucumber from the store versus actually growing one, a lot of misunderstanding. So I'm going to make this really simple as much as possible. Bitterness in cucumbers is caused by two primary factors, either genetics or environment. Stressors, environmental stressors, or a combination of the two, obviously. So, depending upon the variety of the cucumber, some varieties or cultivars are more prone to bitterness than others. Some varieties can be placed in nearly perfect growing conditions and produce bitter fruit. Like Holmes Galbi is one of them, if I pronounce that correctly. It's this European variety. You can put them in nearly perfect condition and it will produce bitter fruit. Whereas others can be put in poor soil conditions and produce completely bitter-free fruit. Like a lot of the melons grown as cucumbers are that way. There's some cultivars that are nearly always bitter, and there's some that are almost never bitter or never bitter at all. And the question becomes, okay, let's say I've got a variety. Sometimes it's bitter and sometimes it's not. What's going on? It's those environmental factors, including climate and things like that. What stresses out cucumber plants? Disturbing the plant roots after planting the seed. That's one of the main ones. Insufficient soil. If you have a small container that you're growing in, poor soil fertility. The plant is not getting what it needs to. Generally speaking, plants will grow slower that way, but sometimes that can cause issues. Inconsistent watering, maybe overwatering, underwatering, overwatering, underwatering. All of a sudden, you've got bitter fruit. Wind damage. The wind chaps the plants, and all of a sudden, the fruit turns bitter. It wasn't anything you necessarily wanted to have happen. All of a sudden, now the fruit's bitter. High heat. A lot of heat will cause the fruit to become bitter. Low heat will cause the plant to dither. It may stress out the plant enough to make the fruit bitter as well. It just depends. Excessive damage from insects or animals. So if insects or animals damage the plant a lot, plant's defense is to make the leaves and the fruit bitter. So that's defending the plant to keep it from continuing to be eaten. If the fruit is picked too late or is too old for fresh eating, some varieties, they become bitter that way. So that's not necessarily a stress factor. A lot of the others are stress factors, but generally speaking, we're looking at stress. We're looking at the variety. So do you have any questions about like stressors?
Yeah, it would make sense to me. And that's how I'm familiar a lot with growing lettuce.
Right.
And that's going to be similar. When you grow it out of season, in the case of lettuce, it's summer, tends to get bitter, heat, so you cool it off, that type of thing. Maybe not related to bitterness, but one question that does come to mind with heat, will cucumbers sun scald? Peppers will, tomatoes will, cucumbers?
Depending upon the variety, they can. Generally speaking, they don't. But let's say that more commonly happens if the plant is going downhill. If the plant is, then the fruit can sun scald. If the plant is getting disease. So, for example, right before powdery mildew hits, or before you see the signs of powdery mildew on the outside and it's happening on the inside of the plant, what's the plant starts to dither and it starts to slow down. When that happens, sometimes fruit can sun scald, but generally it will just turn yellowish. Yeah, so there is a little bit of sun scald, but for the most part, you don't see it too often. It's not something that's really common in cucumbers.
So if you're
Yes.
set, if you're sensitive to bitter in cucumbers, step one, choose a variety that's less prone to bitterness, and then two, ensure just good growing practices, and that will hopefully help steer you clear of that bitterness that you don't like.
There is one more thing I should say about bitterness that is really important to know. If you have a variety that's genetically bitter, let's say even a melon or a regular cucumber that's genetically bitter, you will know because it is so bracingly bitter that it has a bite to it. You take a taste of it and you'll naturally be inclined to spit it out, and it will cause your mouth to become dry and tacky. And that's the kind of bitterness that you have to be really careful of. You generally, most people have not experienced that with cucumbers because it's generally environmental issues. But if it's a genetic bitterness where all the fruit's going to be bitter no matter what, you'll get that racing bitterness. And the only thing you can really do with that is just pull the plant because that's genetic. Yeah. So you just have to be careful. That's a good sign. In that bitterness, if it's that bitter, it will be in the leaves, it'll be throughout the plant. And there's really nothing you can do about that other than pull the plant, because if you save seeds from that plant or plants that it pollinates with, it could produce bitter fruit in the successive generations. So you do have to be careful of that.
Are there varieties that are sought out for bitterness for whatever reason, for some sort of culture? Just they want a bitter cucumber, maybe not so much that you're spitting it out, but just like some people want something that's sweet, some people want something that's bitter for culinary purposes.
Yeah,
Are there
yeah,
bitter?
I know in Asia they have bitter melons, which you know of, but they also have pickling. They call pickling melons, which are a type of melon that you can grow immature as a cucumber, and they'll be bitter in that state. A lot of them. And also in Northern Europe, there are some places where the Halmskelby is grown where they like that bitterness. But they also like salty licorice. So they have
Who
their
knows, right?
quirkiness of the I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
All right.
But go ahead.
So in general, if they're bitter, if you're buying a good variety, it's not going to have much bitterness genetically, and it's most likely an environmental thing, which you can then look to troubleshoot. Probably, I'm thinking too, if it's bitter, you're probably noticing other signs on the plant that something's off.
If you notice the plant is stressed, then the best way to take care of things is to figure out what the issue is as soon as possible and remediate that so that the plant is stressed as little as possible. Now, there are some varieties that bitterness is not an issue, so you don't even have to really worry about it. Yeah, that's neither here nor there because those ones it doesn't matter. But you generally want to take care of your plants no matter what. But cucumbers are generally pretty forgiving. But just like lettuce, you do have to be careful. And if they get stressed out enough, they're not going to produce non-bitter fruit again. It's just going to be bitter from then on, but not bracingly, but just kind of bitter people are used to from the store. Now, let's say you do have a bitter cucumber. When it comes to bitterness is environmental factors, usually that bitterness will be near the surface of the fruit. If you take a slice off either end of the cucumber, you should see some like beads of liquid begin to form between the flesh and the skin. And this layer is where the majority of that bitterness resides. And some people, I'm not saying this doesn't work. They cut the end and then they rub it around to remove the bitterness. And that may work because that may allow the fluids to seep out of the end of the fruit. But it might be just as easy just to peel off that layer. Or some people, if they have bitter fruit, they add salt to it, like a brine, some salt water, and then through osmosis, remove some of that bitterness by substituting it with that salt. One misconception a lot of people have about bitterness is that pollination factor. If a cucumber is pollinated, then it becomes bitter. Now, this is being perpetuated by AI on Google, which is spreading some false information from one website. While it's true that some open pollinated varieties require pollination, and those older open pollinated varieties tend to get bitter as a result of stress, generally speaking, pollination helps fruit quality. And so you have a variety that doesn't require pollination for fruiting, like English Telegraph, that will still become bitter. That's the reverse. It will still become bitter even if it's not pollinated. So will Arkansas little leaf sometimes if it's under stress. In a world where there's always some kind of stress on the plant, it's so much easier just to select the variety that's not going to become bitter as a result of stress. As we continue have these wild fluctuations in temperature and rainfall and all these things, it's going to be important to have varieties that can deal with those stressors that I wouldn't say they're bulletproof, but they're resistant to changes in climate and changes in environment and changes in things. And some Lebanese varieties are pretty good for this, but a lot of melons grown in mature as cucumbers, especially when it comes to that heat you said earlier, once it gets hot, they can become bitter or stop producing fruit. Melons grown in mature as cucumbers. Once it gets over 90, they really start producing fruit. But before that, they'll still produce fruit under 90, but they'll really start pumping it out over 90. Above 100, they're just loving it. At 110, life is good. It just depends upon the variety. But yeah, and those melons growing in mature as cucumbers, a little more easy on the digestion as well. Just putting that out there.
All right. So if you want a non-bitter cucumber, choose a variety that has the least bitterness in it possible. A lot of seed shops, they're going to disclose that. Probably what is saying just non-bitter.
Yeah, bitter free. It like I said, you get any variety to enough stress, you may still get bitterness, even in some of these varieties that shouldn't be. But if the pH is off enough, if there's another one, I didn't even mention that one. If the pH is really, really off, then that can cause bitterness. That's another stress factor. But anyhow, yeah, you just want to select seed that it's not going to be bitter.